Greetings, everyone. Welcome to your affirming interfaith community, Swedenborgian community online, and the Church of the Good Shepherd. Thank you for joining me today. So let's begin just by opening our hearts, our minds to the Spirit's presence today. Allowing divinity at the root of all people, all beings, all things, to settle our mind, illuminate our intrinsic awareness, letting go of our distracted thinking, just letting it come and go like the clouds. And even if it stays, even if some of our thoughts, our feelings, maybe even ones that we would rather get rid of stay, let's be aware of the sky within, the vastness of being that God gives rise to.
Daniel 7, verses 2, 9 through 18, and 27 and 28. Daniel said, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from others, came up out of the sea. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the vision that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts were four kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself." May our reading of the Lord's words be blessed.
Yes, our scripture reading today, and if you read the whole chapter, you'll get a lot more of it, focuses on four beasts that kind of plague the earth in Daniel's vision. And then eventually a time when the Ancient of Days rules over all the peoples and nations of the land, releasing them from oppression, it says, and allowing one like the Son of humanity to come into God's presence. So it's interesting because there are places in the Bible that are pretty trippy, like Daniel 7. One of them being, of course, Revelation at the end of the Bible that has a lot of very similar imagery. Daniel, of course, being a Hebrew text, is one of the earliest roots of this kind of mystical writing, as far as we know, in history. But it's interesting to me because when we start to peel the layers off these images, I think we start to see, instead of something wild and something hard to understand, a message of deep hope for transformation for each of us personally, and also as a society. So reflecting on this, we start with these monsters coming out of the sea, these beasts, it says. And we also have a similar depiction in Revelation where the beast comes and plagues the earth. And many people across history have reflected on what beasts in this negative sense mean in Scripture. And I think we find, as it sort of explains in Daniel, these beasts often represent periods of humanity, kingdoms, kings, a type of ruling or a way of being that oppresses others, that focuses on the more beastly aspects of our natures. And I think this can be true for any religion or for any person or kingdom. And so ultimately, it's a warning or tell about how horrendous we can sometimes behave as humanity. But of course, as we saw through our reading, there's a message of hope at the end, where this God shining brightly uplifts all from oppression and leads all nations and peoples. And I know, historically this has been interpreted somewhat narrowly as meaning, Christianity or Judaism will eventually take over the world. And of course, we see similar interpretations from people in other faiths. Islam believes eventually, some people in Islam believe eventually Islam will, cover the earth. And in a way, I think they're all right, because the root of most of these spiritualities are similar. They center on this deep divinity that uplifts compassion and peace and life. Indeed, as we know from our accounts of the histories of a lot of these people, they've often had periods of times where they've accepted other people of the book, like the Muslims at first accepted Jews and Christians. We see people in every tradition accepting people of other traditions even now, as we do in the Swedenborgian faith most of the time. And I think it's that awareness that the roots of faith are similar, that we're trying to empower divinity in its fullness, not in just our own narrow sense, allows us to really get at the heart of this message. Because I think when we make it about just our faith, as we often uplift in this community, it can be pretty oppressive. And indeed, many mystics believe that the beast in Revelation, and also the four beasts that are thoroughly described in the rest of Daniel 7, if you want to read about them, represent these epochs or this trend in history and within ourselves to dominate with our spirituality. When Scripture talks about the kingdom, it's usually talking about God's kingdom, spiritual kingdom. And when it talks about other kingdoms ruled by beasts, it's still talking about spirituality, just a misused spirituality. And yes, indeed, even one that focuses on the Bible or whatever scripture that can be misused for harm. And that's any scripture, right? Unfortunately, it's our heart's intent, it's our heart's focus and motivation that allows scriptures that focus on social justice and compassion and life to be used for harming others. We see it all over the place in many traditions, historically and even today. Whether it's Buddhism in Myanmar, where some sects of Buddhists subjugate and have even killed Muslims, and of course to the more obvious examples of Christianity and Islam in a lot of different ways, using their religion to harm and oppress others. Unfortunately, we can use most tools for both harm and good. And Scripture, according to Scripture itself, is one of the most potent tools for harm, actually. And Emanuel Swedenborg, with that lens in mind, believed that the beast in Revelation, for example, was the Bible misused for domination. So it's interesting. It stays interesting even as we peel through these layers. I know some of us love just the mysticism and the trippiness of these books, and some of us love more grounded spirituality. And I think when we marry the two, we actually get a lot out of it, because then it makes sense of some of these parts of the Bible that are just hard to fathom. And I feel that way when we apply this to Daniel 7, when we see these beasts one after another oppressing people. I can relate, because as I grow, as the Lord, casts this wind that disturbs my sea, as it describes at the beginning of Daniel, these different monsters come out of me and start to be shed, hopefully, as I open myself to God's presence. And as we see in this story, from one monster to the next, sometimes we can get even worse than we were as we start to change and become spiritual. Because, right, we can use our spirituality to hurt others. We might be a new Christian, a new Hindu, or something like that, or just coming into our faith, and we get pretty zealous. We get pretty, in love and passionate with our specific faith or our idea. And it doesn't have to be a faith, so to speak. It could just be our love of X, Y, or Z, or this is the right political lens, or this is that and that. Whatever it is, we can become obsessed and dominating through it. We can say, well, you should really care about this. And if you don't care about this, then something's wrong with you. And I'm going to have to teach you a lesson if I can. I'm going to dismiss you, et cetera, et cetera. Our arrogant posturing with any of our beliefs can take many different forms, as we see with these monsters in Daniel 7. But as we allow the Ancient of Days to appear, as he does, she does in this story, and take up residency on our internal throne, I think there's hope. And that Ancient of Days, that divinity that speaks through many ancient cultures, many indigenous peoples, many faiths, and every person, will pull us to this day, will uplift us as we allow ourselves to be uplifted into this light of compassionate care that spirituality truly finds its basis in. As we hear towards the end of Daniel, God uplifts all nations and peoples. It doesn't say that God destroys all these different nations and makes all the peoples one specific people or anything like that in this chapter. It actually lists, it says all these nations, all these peoples will be uplifted from their oppression and empowered in the light of God. And I think for me that speaks to the diversity of life. The diversity of life and religiosity and spirituality in our different cultures. It's not about becoming one thing. I think that's what often makes us monstrous when we decide it is. But instead, it's about realizing that this Ancient of Days is infinite, and all the goodness, all the life in all of our communities and all of our spiritualities, all the health, all the empowerment that we find there is from God. It's an expression of God. Even those strange aspects that we don't quite understand in other people sometimes, and sometimes it's just how they look, right? It can be skin color, it can be clothing. Those things, to the extent that they're healthy and good empowerments, that's God shining. And we don't have to take on everyone else's perspective. We don't have to go to every synagogue or church and make a round of it. to accept that this diversity is God in expression, in action, and that the more we let go of our monstrous tendency to oppress, as is described in Daniel, the more we can allow for this openness of heavenly life in and around us. I think today, like Daniel, we can be kind of amazed and worried about the future, as he was at the end of Daniel 7. When we see these monsters at play, these beasts at play within ourselves and around ourselves, whatever their label, whether it's a political one or a religious one or just people in general or our own tendencies or habits, we can become afraid, because then we start to take seriously that weight of monstrosity that we can often be centered in. And I think it's the most scary when we see that in ourselves, when we realize, oh, I've been behaving in this dismissive attitude, this judgmental attitude, maybe even out of hate, divisiveness, and anger. I want to perhaps get rid of all these things that are new to me or different from me. I often lash out at this person or that person that I try to love, but I find hard to love. You know, the list goes on in terms of how we might feel disappointed in ourselves when we start to reflect on ourselves. But I think that message of hope has to be at the core of our thinking, even so, just as it was in this story, that at the root of our life, at the root of our consciousness is God, and it's always been God since time immemorial, since the ancient days. God is the one who uplifts consciousness, uplifts life around us, and our deep connection with each other, even when we feel isolated, when we feel like no one cares, we feel lonely. Indeed, when we become aware of that root of consciousness that actually, in a sense, makes us all one in the divinity of God, of Christ, of Krishna, of Allah, all those many names for God, even just in the Hebrew Bible, we see that we should uplift each other as one, so to speak, but in our diversity, as nations and peoples, instead of lording over others as one of these monsters have. It's that pride and arrogance, as described in Daniel, that often is at the root of our unwillingness to look within and see that interconnectedness. That pride and arrogance that we see through the monsters, especially towards the end, that destroys so many people in this story, is what often gives us a lens of destruction, where we don't really care about other people. They might as well be, 2D images in our lives. And in a way, we ourselves become that the more we're just centered on ourselves as God, as the being to be worshipped, instead of realizing that that divinity is at the root of all beings. And the more we let go of some of these beastly habits, the more we'll find God in expression and in action and around us. So with that message of hope at the center of our meditation, let's just take a moment or two to turn inward, closing our eyes if we feel so called, opening our hands if we feel so called, listening for how the Spirit is speaking to us today. Letting thoughts come and go like the clouds, being aware of the sky of our mind. These types of meditative practices are at the root of most of our traditions. There's good reason for that, as is often uplifted in those traditions. It helps us to become more rooted in that deep-seated consciousness within, that intrinsic peace that is always there, but we tend to not pay attention to it. We're distracted above it, so to speak, or within it. We focus on those distractive, anxious thoughts. And so uplifting those practices is important, whether it's prayer, contemplative prayer, regimented prayer like Daniel is said to have done. Many Muslims do, monks do, many Christians do. A meditative lens throughout our day, just reminding ourselves to be aware of the deeper peace, the sky of mind, as many Buddhists uplift, which is uplifted through Christ's words of peace and comfort, not worrying about the morrow, not caring about the fears that might start to creep up, in a way that is caring for ourselves. When we become too centered on those fears, on that idea of pain in the future, of this mounting debt or something, if you're a student, future of our countries, of the world, we become pulled away from the present moment that actually allows us to engage with those things in a more ableistic way, allows us to become more accepting of the moment and more present to that meditative awareness that we have within.
Asleep in the stable, wax on the table, and tools at his ankles. Forged in the fire, letters in iron, the scar-bearing rider. And up with the sunrise, he unveils his eyes, the world at his side. In the sea of strangers, she searches among them, seeing his face in everyone beside her. In the sea of performers, she searches among them for the one rider. He put on her shoes for her, unbraided her hair, and walked her down to the fair. In the heat of the spotlight, blue shadows on white, she was a sight. And higher the sun rose, he gave her water from a garden hose, and kissed kissed her wet nose. In the sea of strangers, she searches among them, seeing his face in everyone beside her. In the sea of performers, she searches among them for the wild rider. He took off her shoes for her, and he braided her hair. Another day at the fair. He watched her round ribs rise like a barrel of wine, deep, heavy sighs. He hung up her saddle, finished the handle, and blew out the candle. Asleep in the stable, wax on the table, and tools at his ankles. He's the wild rider for 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 the
Well, thank you all for joining with me today and connecting with each other in spirit and life. And so let's each just be aware of the gifts we bring in every moment, uplifting life and spiritual connection, hopefully that light of God's openness and compassion and care as we go forth, knowing that we each are loved. Bye.